You ever hear the expression, where there's smoke, there must be fire? Well, that's just wrong. Sometimes there's really just smoke.
That's Professor Jessica Henry, our guest today on Stuck. And that idea that she just mentioned, smoke but no fire, is what we want to talk about today. It's something that got me interested in this topic of wrongful convictions. See, when I was a young lawyer, not long after I'd been called to the bar, I registered to do some legal aid work, and eventually I got a call. There was a man in Linstead who was in custody. He was in lockup for a long time, no lawyer. The police wanted to question him, but he needed a lawyer to facilitate that questioning. And so I agreed to go for the question and answer. When I went, the man didn't seem to know why he was there. He had made a slight change to his car, but there was nothing illegal about it, and he wasn't sure why the police had locked him up. But he had been in custody at that time for about 2 weeks. I wasn't sure what to make of the situation because he wasn't really a client long term. My job was to help him with the question and answer. He had to go to court to face the charges. He called me and told me that when he went to court, the judge threw out the matter. Why? She said that there was no crime. He had been locked up for 2 weeks for what was no crime at all. With everything that was going on, I just said, what? That's crazy. And it rested at the back of my mind. But I started to think about that experience a lot more this year as I started to investigate this topic of wrongful convictions. Luckily, that man in Linstead had a good judge. He hadn't been convicted of an offense, but he had spent 2 weeks in lockup. And who knows, if there wasn't a vigilant judge, he could have pleaded guilty to something that was no crime at all. It's one of the reasons I was so eager to speak to Professor Jessica Henry. She's done extensive research about no crime wrongful convictions in the US, and she's even wrote a book about it. It's Smoke But No Fire: Convicting the Innocent of Crimes That Didn't Happen. She's also the host of the Just Justice podcast and regularly lends her voice to social issues.
I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides?
How does somebody get convicted of a crime that didn't happen? It's a very interesting topic, at least for me. I really enjoyed speaking to Professor Henry, and I think you will enjoy this conversation as well.
What happens when the justice system gets it wrong? When innocent people are convicted and sent to prison? When they've exhausted all their appeals but still aren't free? Does that ever happen in Jamaica? How big a problem is it? Is there any help, any hope for people like that? I'm Andrew Wiles, and this is Stuck, a podcast exploring wrongful convictions in Jamaica, how they happen, who they impact, and what we can do about them.
Tell the judge, tell the jury.
My name is Jessica Henry, and I am a professor of justice studies at Montclair State University. I'm also a former public defender. I'm an attorney.
Please tell me about how you got into studying wrongful convictions.
Yeah, so as I said, I teach at a university in the state of New Jersey. It's called Montclair State University. And I teach in the Department of Justice Studies. And I developed a course about wrongful convictions.
In your journey teaching this course, you made a very significant discovery that hadn't occurred to you over your professional life as a public defender.
Yeah, so there's an organization called the National Registry of Exonerations, and they track all of the American exonerations that have occurred since 1989. So I would, in preparing my class, often just kind of poke around the National Registry of Exonerations database. And I was looking up one case, and it was designated, they have different classifications, and you can sort the data. And so I looked at a case, and it was a no-crime wrongful conviction. So I thought, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then I sort of clicked more to find out more information. And what I realized, and I was shocked, was that 1/3 of all the convictions in the National Registry of Exonerations at that time, 1/3 involved crimes that never happened in the first place. And I actually thought I was wrong. I thought I must have been sorting the data incorrectly. That couldn't possibly be right. And so I contacted them, and sure enough, it was correct. And today, in 2025, 40% of all known exonerations involve a person who was wrongly convicted of a crime that never happened. And I want to pause on that for a minute, because I was absolutely gobsmacked. I could not believe that was correct. I think when most people think about wrongful convictions, in general, they think about a crime having occurred and the wrong person being convicted of that crime. Yet there are so many people who are wrongly convicted of something that just didn't even happen. And I knew, as soon as I saw that statistic, I knew I needed to know more. And so that's how I came to write my book, Smoke But No Fire, Convicting the Innocent of Crimes That Never Happened. And I looked at sort of how this thing has come to pass. And we know about individual cases, but I think what was significant about what I realized is that this is not just one person here and one person there. There is a phenomenon going on. There is a pattern of people being pulled into the criminal legal system who should never have been there in the first place.
Well, I think people may have had experiences hearing about one case, a suicide that turned out to be charged as a murder, but the data to show that this is a category, right? Yeah. How do you find people receive this information? Do you find that people are surprised, just as you were surprised to find out that here is this whole category of people who are convicted and no crime occurred?
Yeah, I think people are really shocked by it. And again, like in the United States, for instance, there was a recent documentary about a man named Cameron Todd Willingham. And Cameron Todd Willingham was convicted of the murder arson of his 3 children. So you can imagine, he was a vilified person. This happened quite a number of years ago. He was convicted in Texas, and the whole time he had been saying he was innocent. He was just insisting on his innocence. He was executed, and people have now gone back and looked at that fire science and say that was not an arson. It was an accidental fire. And those 3 children who died tragically, but accidentally. So people know about these one-off cases because they're high-profile cases and they get a lot of attention. But the idea that it's not just Cameron Todd Willingham, but it's all of these people that we know of, right? I mean, we know of 3,659 exonerations in the United States. And I want to be clear for your listeners, when we talk about exonerations, that means people who have actually had their cases cleared officially, right? Doesn't include all the folks who are innocent and sitting in prison who have not had their names cleared, right? So there's 3,600 and change people who've been exonerated. Of those, 1,464 people were convicted of crimes that just didn't happen. Wow. And that's really something to think about. Something's going very wrong.
Professor Henry makes the point that because it's so difficult to challenge a wrongful conviction, only a few people will ever be able to do so. And there is a large group of people who will perhaps never be exonerated.
When you think about exonerations in general, those are the cases where someone was able to usually get assistance, whether it's through an innocence project or an attorney or whatever, to take their case and kind of champion it through. And that doesn't include sort of the lower level people, maybe a person who got convicted of a misdemeanor or a less serious crime, who served their time or maybe didn't go to prison but now have a conviction. There's not enough attorneys willing to take these cases on. And so those folks, their names never get cleared. They never get included in the database, and we don't know about them. But I suspect there's a tremendous number of people at the low end who've been convicted of crimes that didn't occur.
Are there some types of crimes that stand out that always or tend to fall into this category?
Yeah, I wouldn't say always, but I can give you some kinds of cases where we see that are represented significantly in the database.
Right.
And again, so we're talking about that classification of people who were convicted and then later exonerated. Let's just look at drug cases for just 1 minute. For instance, in Harris County, Texas, there were a whole bunch of people who were being routinely stopped by the police, and the police would use a field test. And what that really means is they take what they have this little sample, and they take what they think is a substance, an illegal substance, and they test it right there on the street, and then they arrest you. And it is a screening mechanism, and frankly, we know it is highly unreliable. But a lot of people got arrested. A lot of black and brown people, to be clear, were arrested. And many of them pled guilty because they just wanted to go home. So they were accused of this thing. They knew they didn't have drugs. They also knew it could be a really long time before their case was called. Maybe they couldn't make bail. Maybe the prosecution was saying, if you don't take this plea now, I'm going to charge you with the highest levels that I can. You're going to be facing a lot more time. Take your plea now. So people pled guilty. And that's another thing we can talk about, just this idea of innocent people pleading guilty, which they do. But anyway, in Harris County, Texas, so all these folks, many of them pled guilty and they went home. But Harris County did something very unusual. Most of the time in America, when someone takes a guilty plea, their file is closed and that's that. But they wound up sending those quote unquote field tests to the labs. And there was a huge backlog in Harris County. So finally they get the test results back, and one of the prosecutors was like, oh my God, look at all these people who pled guilty, and these substances were not drugs. They were maybe Tylenol, or maybe they were lint, or maybe they were paint.
Pay attention here, where Professor Henry highlights some bright spots, some positives, where prosecutors saw the error that had taken place, and they, on their own initiative, went out and made amends, made things right.
They did their best to find the people who pled guilty so that they could clear those convictions. Those types of cases, for instance, are among the cases that are represented in the database. Other cases where, let's say, police officers went completely off the rails and planted evidence and manufactured crimes, there are wholesale groups of people who've been exonerated based on police misconduct. And when I mentioned that 1,400 plus no crime wrongful conviction number, those are mostly serious. They are not insignificant cases. Right now, as we speak, Andrew, I'm so glad you brought this up, because if this is airing soon, people should get up and get outraged. There's a guy named Robert Robertson who has been on Texas's death row for over 20 years. He is there for murdering his 2-year-old daughter, Nikki. It is a shaken baby case. It is a travesty of justice. That man, as far as I can see, is innocent, and there's no crime that ever occurred. And he is facing an imminent execution unless somebody is able to convince the governor or someone to step in. These can be tremendously serious. There are people serving life without parole sentences currently. There are people serving life sentences, all for crimes that did not happen. And I know we've talked about shaken baby syndrome, and I know we've talked about suicide, but there are a number of other kinds of serious offenses where people wind up being convicted, and those crimes just didn't occur. They just didn't happen.
What role does forensic science play in cases like this for members of the jury, the judges who will be there, and even the defense attorneys? How should they think about the role of forensic science in no crime wrongful convictions?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think, a lot of my students, I don't know what television shows sort of get exported to Jamaica, but I can tell you a lot of my students watch, CSI and Law and Order, and they're always thinking, where's the DNA, or where's the fingerprint, or whatever it is.
Seen this before?
Yeah, it's the watch I gave my nephew a few months ago. Where did you find it?
There are skin cells embedded in the band.
Skin cells?
Did you know that our entire genetic code is stored in a single cell?
Detective Stabler, my partner, Detective Benson. How did my name come up?
Fingerprint hit.
Oh, on what exactly?
Money.
Well, the way I gamble my prints on a lot of dough.
We now know that a lot of the forensic science is not that reliable. It's just not. Anytime a scientist has to do a data comparison, there's room for subjectivity, there's room for opinion, then there's room for error. Even with fingerprints, unless you get like a really clean, clear fingerprint, kind of the kind that you have to give when you register for whatever it is, there's often a comparison that has to be done. And even fingerprints, which we've all been taught, like, oh, everyone has their unique fingerprint. People get it wrong. People get it really wrong. Anytime it's like, because, in most of the crime scenes, it's not a clean fingerprint, right? It's a smudge, it's a whatever. And then there's a subjectivity that comes into play. That's a problem. It is impacted by cognitive biases, right? So if someone is looking at, for instance, a child's death, and they, for whatever reason, think something suspicious is afoot, they will look at that and they'll bring that lens to the conversation, and that will color what they find. So there's that one thing, just the misinterpretation, that there's a mislabeling that occurs. It triggers cognitive biases. People make inferences that are not supported by the evidence. Like going back to that fire case I was just talking about, if you have a fire expert who's also a police officer, right, who shares that role coming in, then they're looking for a crime. And when you're looking for a crime, there are things you might see that if you were just being objective like a pure scientist should be, you wouldn't see that. But there's also just flat out fraud. Again, in the United States, in Massachusetts, the crime labs were rocked. They were just rocked. When a scientist named Annie Dookhan decided to kind of make a name for herself by being the most productive chemist in the drug lab. Well, she wasn't being the most productive. She was fabricating evidence, and thousands of cases had to be thrown out because her results were not reliable.
The names of more than 40,000 people have been identified whose drug evidence may have been mishandled by former state lab chemist Annie Dookhan.
Annie Dookhan, a chemist, is at the center of a statewide legal scandal. Dookhan's accused of mishandling evidence in cases while she worked for 9 years at the Department of Public Health Drug Lab in Massachusetts.
They were manufactured, they were fabricated. And so that's another way that forensic science can be unreliable, is through things like fraud. And we saw that with a man named Fred Zain, who used to just make up blood, DNA results. He would just make them up. There was an odontologist who claimed he could match marks on a person's body to a person's teeth. His name was West, Dr. West, and he was a disaster. He just made things up. And the people were convicted and spent decades in prison because of West and because of Fred Zain and because of Annie Dookhan. So that's another way in which we see forensic science being unreliable. Some of it's the science itself is not reliable, and some of it is that the people who are claiming to have done the science are not providing reliable testimony.
Sometimes it's not the police and it's not the forensic evidence and it's not the prosecutors. Sometimes it's people who make false accusations.
Obviously, sexual assault, rape, these are significant issues. They're underreported. People who survive rape and sexual assault, are often not believed by the police. That process is a terrible process, and it's an undercounted event, an undercounted crime. And yet, we also know that there are people who are wrongly convicted of rapes and sexual assaults that never occurred. And that happens also. So it's not just the police that are fabricating stories. It can sometimes be people who, for a variety of reasons, they want revenge on an ex-boyfriend. They want to cover up their own wrongdoing. There was or not wrongdoing, but there was a case where a young woman was having, had a boyfriend that her parents didn't know about. She didn't want them to know, and she got pregnant. So she invented a rape to explain why she was pregnant. And then she had to find a perpetrator. And then she helped get him convicted. And he spent decades in prison, and that crime never occurred.
What are some solutions?
Well, I think, one is just to bring healthy skepticism, right? So I think you had mentioned the idea of shaken baby syndrome. There was, like shaken baby is a really good example, because what happens in a shaken baby syndrome case is, a child will suddenly become lethargic or whatever. They'll be brought to the hospital, and let's say the child dies. If the child has exhibited sort of this triad of symptoms, swelling, bruising, and bleeding in the brain, some people will be quick to diagnose shaken baby syndrome. And the problem with shaken baby syndrome is that because these symptoms are believed to emerge immediately after this abuse has occurred, whoever was last in the baby's presence is the person by definition who must have done the harm, right? And so it's an incredibly difficult thing to defend against, because in some ways the prosecution, as long as they can bring in an expert to say, look, the baby had this triad of symptoms and Sam Smith was the person last in their presence, it must have been Sam, they almost don't have to prove their case. They don't have to prove what happened because it must have happened. But knowing that and being prepared to defend against it requires being skeptical and thinking critically about the forensic science. It requires really advocating for experts. When you've got an arson case or a shaken baby case or a case that involves a gunshot wound, for instance, and there's a question about where the source of that gunshot wound came from, right? I think, again, we were talking a little bit about suicide. You need to have an expert who can really challenge some of the assumptions that the prosecution's experts will bring in.
The need for independent experts, independent forensic experts, it's something that has come up already. The Privy Council pointed out in the case of Lessine Edwards. And I can tell you, based on episodes that are to come, it's something that we hear again and again and again. The type of evidence that comes to court today is increasingly more complex than it was in 1960. It's going to require your lawyer to understand it, and a person who's charged is going to need somebody independent of their lawyer to explain it to the jury where it is in their favor, where it is exculpatory, where it shows something positive to your defense. This is a big problem because we don't have independent experts in all the areas that we need them.
In America, there's a big scandal. Well, I shouldn't say a big scandal. There was a scandal, perhaps a little scandal. Perhaps only the people who paid attention were the people who were impacted. But, the FBI used to send in these incredibly polished, really smart experts to talk about forensic science in the context of guns. And they claim they could match bullets to guns, and they could match bullets to batches of bullets. And they would come in and, your client would just get sunk because it was very, very impressive. But it was bad science. And you needed to know that this can't actually happen the way they're saying it does in order to challenge it. So when there's a forensic-based case and you've got a client that's sort of saying, I didn't do this, it's important to say, okay, what else are we looking at here? If the expert got it wrong, what's the rest of the narrative? How do we get underneath? At the lower level, it's sort of problematic because a lot of times clients just don't have the bandwidth to fight. And I talk about this in my book, but it's something that has stuck with me all these years, and I've been doing this a long time. But when I started out as a young attorney doing, as you're calling it, I did not work for the New York Legal Aid Society, but it was also a public defender office, a nonprofit organization. We used to get these trespass cases in. At the time, the mayor of the city was Mayor Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani, and he had this whole big thing that they were going to clean up the streets, and they were on this big trespass thing, and they would go into these very large buildings. I used to work in the South Bronx, and they had these very tall apartment buildings that were subsidized housing or public housing, and they would just arrest people in the lobby. And so you could live in the building but not have had your ID and wind up getting arrested for trespassing. You could have swung by to visit your aunt who wasn't home And because you didn't live in the building, you could get arrested for trespassing. But of course, that's not trespassing. None of those things I just described are trespassing. You're allowed to be there. And so I would say to my clients when I get these cases, and they were minor cases, they didn't have like significant criminal consequences in the sense that they weren't going to go to prison, they weren't even going to get jail time. It was just, I would say to them, please come back. If you'll come back to court, I will fight this tooth and nail. You did not commit trespassing. You should not get this on your record. And most of my clients, almost all of them refused. They just pled guilty. And they pled guilty for real practical reasons that I understand. Going to court is very time consuming. Maybe they didn't have childcare. Maybe they couldn't take off more work. Maybe they were caregivers in other capacity. Maybe they just didn't want to suffer the indignity of having to go back through the whole get into court and clear security and all the things that go on and waste the day sitting there for their case to be called. That, to me, requires a larger challenge. Like if you start to see patterns of things, it wasn't just me, and eventually there was a lawsuit against the city about these trespass cases, and they had to stop the practice. I didn't bring that lawsuit, to be clear, but it was brought. That's something else to think about, because when your client is telling you they were there lawfully, and you can see they were there lawfully, and they wind up pleading guilty, that's a wrongful conviction too. And that's pointing to something larger about society and larger about our criminal legal system and how we treat the poor and how we treat people who are vulnerable to police interventions. One thing we know for sure is that wrongful convictions often happen because folks are so overburdened and under-resourced, right? And so even the best of intentioned lawyers may not have the ability to slow down and look at the cases. And prosecutors also have significant burdens and pressures on them to get cases through, to get their victories as defined by convictions. And so taking a moment to slow down and really consider these cases, advocating for more resources for legal aid, advocating for access to experts is really important, and more training for attorneys in those areas. But it's not just that, right? I mean, there's again, in the United States, there's been a lot of issues with these sort of police units that have created convictions for crimes that didn't happen. Like, we need to look at how policing is being done, and think about ways to do it differently, because we have a problem. And if innocent people can be wrongly convicted of crimes that never happened, think about what that says on a much larger level about our entire system. There's a lot to unpack. And a lot of ways that these types of crimes occur. And when they do, it's an injustice not just for the person who winds up being wrongly convicted and losing years and sometimes decades of their lives behind bars, but it's an injustice for us all. Because those resources that are spent manufacturing crimes that never happened could be better spent serving our community.
That was my conversation with Professor Jessica Henry. You can find her at jessicahenryjustice.com. To find out more about everything we discussed, go to my website at andrewwiles.com/stuck. I hyperlink many of the things that we discuss throughout our conversation. Until next week, I'm Andrew Wiles, and this is Stuck.
Hey, thanks for listening. Stuck is written and presented by me, Andrew Wiles. It is brought to you by The Wave on the Frequency Network. Subscribe to Stuck wherever you get your podcasts. You can read more about the project at andrewwiles.com. And if you found the conversation interesting or helpful, share it. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.
But stuck. innocent, 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 bust up, innocent, 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 yeah, bust up, stop, innocent, bust up, stop, innocent, bust up, innocent. Bust up, stop, bust up, bust up, stop, bust up.